son of his elder brother, desperate to be king himself. Osrith glanced back at the man, who was slowly surveying the room, while drinking from a flagon of, presumably, ale. His eyes met with the serving maids, who instantly moved out of his way, or turned their heads, and when he moved over to speak to a merchant noble, the whole discourse lasted barely more than 2 minutes. Not trusted, Osrith concluded. But then she turned to Elfrith. But, was it not decided by the Witan? She asked, thinking about the Gaelish succession. The best of a group of potential successors was chosen. Well, yes, Elfrith replied. But, you know, Alfred's father, Ethelwulf. Did you know he took Alfred to Rome? Really? The youngest of 6 siblings, and the king chose his youngest son to make the pilgrimage. Had high hopes for his son, Osrith commented. Or, was the most expendable, Elfrith added. Well, he continued, pulling Osrith a little closer. On the way back, they stopped at the court of King Charlemagne. Well, not Charlemagne himself, but the Carolinians. Elfrith's voice took on a conspiratorial tone, and Osrith thought to herself that the Devonshire warrior really was a gossip. He caught the eye of a noble lady, Judith, and married her in Reims. So, Alfred got a stepmother, and Ethelwulf got a lesson in succession from Charles the Bald, which was, only the firstborn son would do. So that's what King Ethelwulf did, intend to appoint Ethelbald. Only, Elfrith smirked. His eldest son had taken matters into his own hands and attempt to usurp his father. That's awful, Osrith exclaimed. Or necessary. The king left the country for a whole year, with Danish incursions still going on. My guess is that the Witan had appointed Ethelbald temporarily so as to make decisions which only the king could. He nodded to Ethelbald. So now, with that precedent, he thinks he should have gained his father's throne, and has made it his life's ambition to let everyone know. And do something about it. He's cunning, Osrith added. Nah, too lazy for that, which is why Wessex would be Danefeed if Ethelwald was king. All of the lords know it, and Alfred keeps him close, so he can keep 2 eyes on him and ale available at a distance, might plot far more effectively. Come on, Osrith, Elfrith insisted, knocking her out of her thoughts. There will be no ale left, and no whores. You want a whore? Osrith asked. She knew men did go to them, but was shocked that she was so close to the action, as it were. Don't you? No. Elfrith looked at her, slyly. Not that tall, red-haired beauty? Osrith drew to a halt just outside the gates. No, Elfrith, Osrith said. I do not want a whore, I do not want a wife or a husband. I want only to be a warrior. She looked away. Because I have been given a second chance, and I want to serve. Anyway, she added, as they trod the dirt path to the south of Winchester, it was that or the church, and given all I've done in my life, I doubt God would appreciate my turning up at a monastery. Given what I've done in monasteries, Osrith added to herself. Suit yourself, Elfrith said. But don't mind if I do. 88,888,888. You have been given leave to visit the inn too then, Steeper. Elfrith's jolly greeting made the head of Alfred's household guard turn round. It has been known, Elfrith, my friend, he replied, ale in hand. He looked past Elfrith and fixed his eye on Osrith. Gale, you fought well the other day, Steeper said, then turned back to his drink. Well, that was something, Elfrith said, grinning at Osrith. He rarely says anything, you must have impressed him, with the awh. He added. Osrith looked surprised. I did not even know I did that, she admitted. Milk in tankard, and they sat near the stairs. Elfrith regaled Osrith with stories of Devonshire, and his family, how his brother had taken over the family farm on the Lord Odder's estate, and how kind he always was to the family. So, what happened to his son? Osrith asked, as she watched a steady stream of girls appear on the balcony above the bar, make their way down the steps and circulate amongst the 2 cranes' customers. Die in battle? Died at Odder's hand, Elfrith replied. He murdered his son? Osrith could hear the shock in her voice. Murdered a traitor, Elfrith clarified, grimly, before taking a swig of ale. Alfred called men to Ethan Dun, and young Oda was to have answered the call to him on behalf of his father. When he did not arrive with the Devonshire Fid, Alfred came to Oda's estate to find out why. And why? Osrith, tankard half to her lips, enthralled. Because he had made a bargain with Danes in the area and was giving them shelter, that's why. Claimed he never received the letter. Alfred shook his head, when he knew full well that was Alfred wanted because the messenger said so. The messenger ended up leaving Otter's estate, but never made it back to Alfred. Danes, Alfred added, as if Osrith couldn't guess. So Otter took a knife to his own son, for his treachery. Osrith thought back to her lord's hall, and where this must have taken place. Mildred would have been present. Tutored had abandoned her by then. We heard of Ethan done in Alba, Osrith said, and knew it was a special victory. My king sent help to the king of Alba against the Norse, she added, twisting the truth, but the kingdoms that are not Dulria to are still a threat, and do not willingly accept his rule. Like Wessex, and the kingdoms it is trying to rule, nodded Elfrith. Sent is a particularly troublesome province. They remember only too well they received Augustine, and, well, go low. Osrith looked past her comrade, and felt her heart sink. Good evening, Elfberg, she greeted the woman. Good evening, Osrith, Elfberg replied, taking her glass. Goat's milk, I see. Do you suffer with the king's ailment? I suffer from not being able to do my job properly if I drink ale each evening, Osrith clarified. Elfberg took her cup and left. So that's why you wouldn't say. Elfrith looked at Osrith as if he had worked out her secret. You wouldn't name a whore because you already had a whore. No, Osrith protested. I used to buy food here. She would never leave me alone. I never had money for a bed. Elfrith took her shoulders in his left arm. Well, you do now, eh? Osrith squeaked, thinking of the silver of Sobrits that she had managed to get out of Alba and was, now, insecurely residing between two floorboards in the upper stables, where the guards slept. From Odda. Wages. Go on. Osrith made to get to her feet, but as she did so, she noticed Elfberg carrying over another jar of milk, which Osrith insisted in paying for. She noticed the girl's downcast eyes as she left their table. Hey, Elfga! Elfrith shouted, suddenly, and waved a hand. Got away. Did you? Just about, Elfga complained. Miral only left me to look after the Lord Odda. He was all right after he had been sick twice, and they sent in one of Steeper's guards when he passed out. Osrith nodded to the bar where Steeper was. That's unusual. Steeper rarely leaves the palace, and, look, there he goes. Elfga thumbed in the guard's direction. Back to his post. Committed, Osrith replied, a vague sadness creeping over her, for he was not the only head guard so committed to his lord. Should be, Elfga laughed. Elfrith slapped his arm. He's not that dense, he chided his friend. Elfrith added, nodded towards the door. Back again, the Lord of Cookham. Your king's enemy? He added. Osrith turned to look. The men followed behind her brother, and sat at a large table near the entrance. Osrith examined Utard's face. She remembered him. A blunt pain dragged at her chest. She remembered that day, the day he had arrived back to Bibbenberg. Osrith had wanted him to take her away with him, thought that had been the reason, and had kept on hoping. He had long hair, like the Danes. Perhaps she should have known then, but his features were the same. Same eyes, same nose, upturned a little, same mouth that turned up at the corners even when he wasn't saying anything humorous. And, of course, he commanded loyal men, fighting as he did for Alfred. See. Elfga nodded. High hopes, this one. Not content with the Lord Odda's service. Osrith snapped her head back round. No, she began, then faltered. Elfrith gave her a wide grin, but not for Utard. Elfberg was bringing over her tankard. No charge, she said, as Osrith withdrew a coin. Osrith dragged herself to her feet, wanting to hit Elfrith for his not-so-coy encouragement of her manner towards the woman. Yes, Osrith insisted, pressing a bronze coin into her hand. I pay my way. No, Elfberg replied, slowly, looking doe-eyed at Osrith. A gift, and it would be rude not to accept. Elfberg made to put a hand on Osrith's arm, but she shook it away. furiously, knocking the milk over as she did so. Elphaba gave her a hurt look for a moment, before reaching over to the bar for a rough cloth to soak up the milk. "If not milk," she said, touching Osrith on the arm, "perhaps beer, or else." She flicked her eyes heavenwards. "Look, Elphaba," Osrith said, staring at the woman, trying to get her to listen as she shook her arm from Elphaba's grasp, memories of half stirring in her mind. "I did want the milk, I don't want anything else. Wait." Her words upset Elphaba, who took up the tankards from Osrith's table, sweeping out of her way. "Wait." She made to go after her, but a warrior stood in his way. Tall and slim, the man was staring down at her. "You upset her," he accused, holding out a hand as Osrith made to move past the woman, and stepped in front of Osrith. Instinct, and her hand was on Buie, and she glared back at the dark-eyed challenge. "Cithric," a voice called from behind the man. "Leave him." Osrith looked past the man called Cithric and into the face with her brother. Utad. He was amused at his man's challenge of her, and clearly did not take it seriously. "I did not welcome her offer," Osrith said simply, her voice weighty as she considered her options. The man looked easy to fight, but fight and win. His comrades would back him, but would Elfrith and Elphaba back her? No, it would not do to fight. And yet, this boy Cithric had challenged her motives. He had begun to draw his sword. Osrith drew quicker as shouts and shrieks filled the two cranes. A man behind the bar, next to a quivering Elphaba, was already reaching under it. Buie. Victory. The blade was in front of the warrior who, through age, inexperience, alcohol, who knew, had barely time to unsheath his hand, now still on the scabbard. Osrith changed her stance, not looking away from the dark eyes of this volatile warrior. A few words from her left, and Osrith froze. A blade was near her throat. "If you wish to live, boy, you will put the sword down." And Osrith did lower Buie, and took a step back, to the obvious relief of Elfrith, who had exhaled with some force behind her. She was also aware that Steeper, the king's guard, was watching her, carefully as she put Buie to bed. Osrith turned to look at her challenger, as a smirk crossed the face of the warrior called Cithric. She would remember his face, this man, so many times in her future thoughts. Not much taller than she was, fine and agile, had a quickness of thought in his eye, though his face was much leaner than when she would know him better, and the haunting of his enslavement had begun to decline. His hands were on Soul Stealer, she knew that later. Now, though, she lowered her head, as if in deference, then sprang. Osrith did not know if she yelled her battle cry when she leapt at the man Cithric's legs, low and strong, pulling them together with all her might, but she was when she had scooped up the man and threw him into the dirt on the inn's floor before sinking her teeth into what turned out to be Cithric's sword arm down, and Osrith threw herself at Finan, careering into one of the tables. "Touch Dean!" Osrith shouted at him, as adrenaline drove her next move. "What did you call me, you little turd?" Finan screamed back, struggling to get to his feet, while at Utad's table the men were beside themselves with laughter. "Come on," urged Elfrith, who was by her side. "We were with you, it'll be us next." "Some help you are," Osrith shouted back as they thrust through the inn's door, while behind them the scream of, "Get them!" roared after them. After a while, once Elfrith and Elphaba had thrown themselves past her and had raced back towards the palace, Osrith watched as her brother's men wound their way through the streets of Winchester. The fight had soon gone out of the two warriors she had challenged, and they were now, arm in arm with other warriors in her brother's company, making their way unsteadily away from the inn and north, away from the palace too. Osrith knew this because she was now making her own way in pursuit of them as they sang, merrily, as they traversed. Osrith wondered how long it would be until Elphaba and Elfrith realized she was not with them. Not yet, or else they had decided to not to look for her. Osrith watched her brother's men again, as a pang of sadness entered her heart. After all she had gone through to get there, all she wanted was to get to him, to tell him, her brother, Utad, that she was alive. Hadn't she told Elfrith she wanted to be a warrior? Not Hodda's warrior, but a warrior nonetheless, with Utad. That had been her fantasy, as she had headed nearer and nearer to Wessex, to tell him, to ask him for her to be with him. Despite all she knew, that he was a pagan, that he had pushed aside his wife, that he was known as Daneslayer and Utad the Wicked. "Come on," laughed a huge man, bald, with huge arms, one of which he draped round the shoulders of the warrior Cithric as they meandered down the street. "I'm going back, one more drink," said her brother. The smaller, black-haired man, her challenger, stopped suddenly. "No more, my friend." "I'm going." Utad tried to wrest himself from the man's embrace. "Utad, we have drunk that bar dry, we have boarded that good ship, Long Mathane Ryan Nagmadane." Whoops of delight from those who also knew the song of the good ship Venus, and began to sing it in clumsy verse. Osri slipped over to another thatch to keep up with them. Over the rooftops she traversed, nimbly and stealthily, watching the inebriated men hit one another's shoulders, laughing, or imitating someone or something for the comedy of the thing. They were heading south, near to the Itchen, and Osrith watched them walk the river path towards a well-appointed, spacious house, which they entered. It took her minutes to climb over the adjacent roofs and heave herself silently, carefully, into the thatch. Below, a mezzanine and stairs. Osrith had a view through some of the thatch into the house, though she couldn't see much. People were moving about, tankards were being thrust onto a table. Someone was shhhhshhhshhhshhhing them. So, presumably Utad's wife and children were home. But what could she do? Utad had a life here, one of a warrior, husband, father. He had men loyal to him. Osrith looked at the sky. The seasons were moving on. Mornings were getting light sooner. Even the constellation of the hunter was too low to be seen now. She leaned over the roof and stared down into the darkness of the yard. Utad may well welcome her, Osrith knew, but there would be little chance of retaining her position in Oddersgard. If he was a good brother, he would see her married where she consented, or simply married for advantage. If not, it was the way of things. If she had wanted that, Osrith might simply have stayed with King Domhnall in Alba. Under no circumstances would he allow her to be a warrior, which is why she could not reveal herself yet. Osrith knew she must gain wealth or status, or both. Then she could have more of a say. Besides, she liked the life of a warrior. She liked fighting. Rolling back into the thatch, she stared at the stars again. Owls hooted. On nights like these it felt like just her and the ether of space, and that she could do anything. A scratching below and a creak made her start, and she gripped the thatch. If not Utad, then Father Booker. If he was not in Winchester, he should be easy to locate, through the meticulous records of the church. But the same still stood. He would feel obliged to marry her off, and remove her from Oddersgard. With care, she looked downwards. Someone had come out from her brother's house and was just below, in the darkness. Someone who was trying to be as silent as possible, but his boots creaked a little in the earth. When Osrith pulled herself up, she lay with the flat of her back to the straw, and studied the stars again. What was funny was that some of them were slightly different. Some of them were a pale red color, some were a yellow-white, and some a pale blue. Some were more intense than others, some weren't even stars at all, but pale smudges against the black of the night. Below her, someone was walking. Osrith closed her eyes for a moment, picturing the face of the man she now knew to be her brother. What was he like, really like? Was he funny? Did he like to hunt? How did he like poetry? Was he devout? No, he was not devout, not a Christian. Anyway, her heart beat in her chest as she considered how easy it would be for her to find out, to go down and seek him out. He had fought, and defeated Great Danes. He had been a slave. He had taken a Danish bride, and, staring up to the sky, the adrenaline at the success of actually finding her brother coursed through her. She could be one of his men, beg for a place by his side, fight with him. Only, the inevitable would happen. When it was discovered she couldn't piss in front of the men, and that under her shirt were bindings. Had she been a boy, she could have come to Utad with ease. But if she had been his brother, Osrith considered, she would be his enemy, come to oppose him at Bibbenberg. She would not have been Constantine's, nor travelled to Irion. She would not have been in Wessex and Dash. Just the faint clearing of a throat, and Osrith peered over again. The man who had challenged her, standing up to her because of his friend, was fingering the hilt of his sword. He looked nervous, or bored, or perhaps neither of those things, because that's what Osrith would have wanted any attacker to think of her as being, to make them drop their guard. She peered as closely as she could to the man. What had he done that he had penanced his hair? Osrith reached up for her own. It was growing back. A long time ago in a land far away, Flancina said it must. Flames, remembered at the Tara Fair, appeared in her mind. Was she such a traitor to her sex that she didn't care? Lilting music permeated the air. The man was singing. What was all the more strange was that Osrith knew every word. It was one sung at Dunotamost feast nights, about a girl never to be seen again, lost to a man as he fought for his lord. The sound of it made Osrith think about Haf, the British servant girl working for Guthard at Caerliguilid. Osrith stopped suddenly, reaching her hand round to her face. In her desire not to fall from her brother's two-story house, Osrith had buried both hands deep inside the straw. It was just that, when she brought them out, her left one was generously crossed with a great deal of silver. She pushed her hand inside her shirt, inside her bindings, for a handful of silver nestling tightly around her breasts would see her nicely for a good while. Osrith had no qualms about taking it. It had probably been stolen countless times before Utad had stolen it and hidden it in his roof, and withdrew her hand, steadily. The singing had stopped. Osrith stopped too. A nice night, Lord, for harvest. The man spoke with an accent, presumably not too dissimilar to how Osrith must sound. He was intriguing. Where in the Gaeltacht did he come from, and why was he in the company of her brother? Hayad, the big youth training to be a warrior, sang songs like this, in Welsh. A good song. A second man trod carefully next to the first. This man was taller, larger than the first, by the tread of his boot. I like it. Sing it again. No, not that one, the first man said, in the tone of voice that sounded as if he had been caught baring his soul and was trying to cover the wound up, and his voice carried up to Osrith, an upbeat, confident sound, about a laddie who loved a lassie, and wished to make a match, but was concerned about her father. Osrith knew this one. Domhnall had sung it, notably on the way back after her hellish riding lesson at Glen Orchy. The song came to a sudden end and Osrith sat up in alarm. What? The second voice asked, as the owner of the first began to hurry on moist earth. Another singer. Osrith slammed her hand over her mouth. To her horror she realized she had been singing along. And away, over the roof and the stable, across the barn and down to the ground. It wasn't long until she would get to the start of Winchester's buildings and she would be able to traverse them directly to the palace. But, before that there was a 200-yard deficit, where she had to run on open ground. Stones littered it, and she stumbled a little while all the time the first pair of feet, of the Gaelish speaker, gained on her. She felt the hand even thought the outbuildings of the city's first dwellings, where she had saved Odda, were mere feet away. Who are you? A hand crushed her shoulder. Osrith stopped and turned back, where the face of the man whom she had tricked in the two cranes leered at her. Seodusa. She spat back, with emphasis. Euphramine, he exclaimed, his eyes narrowing. But he was too late, and she had slipped from her jerkin and was up the nearest building in the time it took him to realize he had nothing except a piece of clothing. I'll get you and cut your balls off. The man screamed up at Osrith. Already, she was 3 buildings away. You can try, she retorted, and ran. She had escaped, with a bosom full of silver, back to the palace. 88,888,888. I saw you climbing into the roof this morning, Elfrith said, as they assembled before Steeper. Half-clothed, you dirty thing. One thing Osrith did have with her carried from Dunnottar without Sainid's permission, was another change of clothes. She looked across at her comrade as Steeper looked with resignation at the condition of Elfgar's blade. You don't have to tell me, you were with the whore. Osrith shot him a narrow-eyed glance as 2 young trainees hurried before them, late. The opposite, in fact, she thought, wryly. I came home with silver, not spent it. I came home pox-free. No one is pregnant. Let that warrior Sihtric woo her, for that was what he wanted, and jealousy had sprung up from what he thought Osrith's intentions were. She had found her brother, and spent most of the night wandering about him. After finding a temporary hiding place for 2 years' warriors' wages in a gap in the stonework at the back of the stables with the money she had left from that which had travelled with her from Bibbenberg to Dunnottar to Wessex, again stolen, she exhaled. Okay, you just might have told me that's where you'd gone, rather than me worrying half the night. Sorry. She withdrew Buet, as Stipa inspected it. No corrosion. Of course not. Buiard was an extension of Osrith's arm, and losing it meant losing part of herself. As such, she would never neglect it. Miral stood to one side, frowning at them. He watched Godwin and Hayard gain a dressing down from the head of the Mercen Guard for tardiness. But this did not last, and he was directing the young warriors in practicing their sword skill. Up, across, back swing, weave, dodge, thrust. You need to be careful, Elfrith hissed. Careful where he puts his cock, Elfgar asked, slyly. Osrith gave him a narrow-eyed sneer too, but it was a handy excuse that they thought she was with Elfbar for, of course, she had been nowhere near her. You need to be careful about Danes. Norse and Danes have been invading into the land of the East Saxons, Elfrith hissed, as Miral paced over to Odda's 2 trainees. Alfred wants to retain peace, but many, including the Lord Odda, are agitating to war. The peace holds, Elfrith, Elfgar said. If there had been a breach of the peace, if King Ethelstan of East Anglia, Guthrum as was, had failed to keep his side of the pact, then that makes Daneland null and void? Daneland, Osrith thought, grimly. Danelaw? She remembered with a shudder that Dane Heston and his men, and Gert giving silver over to them so she could remain. Peace. Yes, but at a price. And, Osrith thought, those people living in the eastern lands of Mercia, they will not think it a good bargain with Danes ruling over them. Maybe because Englaland was too big, or bigger, at least, than Alba, that Alfred could not hold all of the kingdoms. Even King Domhnall had difficulty, and he only had to unify 3 kingdoms. Alfred had the heptasy, 7 kingdoms, if he wanted a unified country. Not counting Cornwall, or Wales, where petty kings ruled petty kingdoms, and kept themselves to themselves. As a pair of swallows swooped down into the palace's square gardens, Osrith's eyes caught the form of someone else. Really? He was much too young. Though, she had held and used a sword, fed a sword, to good effect against the Norse at 12. Do not pair him with me, Osrith thought, desperately. I've had enough of young kings in waiting. Elfrith looked where Osrith was looking, and nudged Elfgar. Come on, young Etheling. Stipa's voice was steady, but no different to when he was instructing any of them. The blonde-haired, well-set young man was looking around, observing the sword practice. You are to watch the men. Osrith refused to look further. It was bad enough she had been chosen to fight Stipa and the whole of the royal household had come out to watch. If she caught Stipa's eye, or Miral's for that matter, then Prince Edward would be positioned against her. Even now, Stipa's dog training was picking out her sword thrusts, as she defended, then parried, with Elfrith, making the young man understand why she was getting the upper hand in the fight, which she was. Osrith had gained at least 6 feet of ground, and had worked her comrade to the back of the practice ground. He was trying to match her, but Osrith had realized that the area had a slight slope to it, and she was forcing him downhill slightly, and Elfrith was having to work hard to at least maintain his position. If he was to win, he would have to do more than defend his position. Beside them, she could hear Stipa point out her leg position, which was side on, just a little, which again gave her the edge. That was the thing, just a little edge here, and a little edge there, which meant that those unprepared, or not as canny, would be a loser before they had really got started. She raised Buet, and charged at Elfrith as he neared the stable wall, her lungs filling with air. Elfrith looked terrified. Then a smile came across his face as she suddenly stopped, miming an action which, on the battlefield, would have taken his throat. I yield, he yelled, before stepping towards Osrith, and the inevitable happened. You will fight the Etheling, Now Steeper had taken Osrith by the shoulders. Edward was beaming at her. "You won't be smiling for long," Osrith thought back, but couldn't help smiling a little back at him. The most likely candidate for future King of Wessex. His ability in battle would tell much, for the Witan needed to choose someone with wisdom as well as battle ken. She had been rewarded for her ability to overcome Elfrith by having to teach the Atheling of Wessex. The boy had obviously been coddled. A short sword in hand, he stood fiercely opposite Osrith, holding it out to her, a mask of ferocity over his face, but a wrinkle of terror at his eyes. He had determined himself to be brave, but he felt frightened. Give him a moment, Osrith thought, for it was learning to control fear that was the key. The next battle fought was just routine, just the next thing to do, an automatic action. If you thought about the blood, and the reek and the actual human devastation, you could never stand on a battlefield, and the enemy had won without any steel having been daylit at all. Osrith drew Bué, holding her out in front of her. Edward was trying to fix her with a determined stare. At this point, Osrith would have borne down on a youngster, for they would not have been ready for her ferocity. But she needed to be a little yielding, so he could find his feet and dash. "Go at him, Osrith!" yelled Steeper. "He will learn nothing if you dance around like that," and drove on. Surprisingly, Edward stood firm, and surprised her by ducking under her arm. Behind her, she felt a little prick to her jerkin. A little prick from a little prick, she thought, unkindly, and circled back, raising her sword under his own blade. But Edward held on, though his feet were unsteady, and parried forward.